to the cloud. All right, I think I'm all set. But I didn't hear the sound say recording. I don't know what it is, okay? But anyway, so now let's open it. Day one, Edward. All right, so before I begin, okay, there is water bottle outside at the checkout area, okay? And the idea is if you go to the Not Scary Farm tonight, you can take a water bottle with you. But just so you know that if you open the water bottle, then they won't let you take in. You have to empty the water bottle. So any half-drink water bottle, okay, that the seal is broken, they don't let you take in with the water. And then if you have any kind of reusable water bottle, they will ask you to empty it before you can take it in. Just so you know, that's a rule, okay? What is that? Yeah, if it's the seal is unbroken, then you can take it in. All right, so now, so this section we're going to talk about some other Elliott feature that we have not talked about yet. So today our focus has been on report desk and power search. And but there are other features. Okay, so that's basically what the intention of this section. Tomorrow I'm going to take another section called the number 2 version of this one. Today is the number 1 version. And so the first feature I want to mention to everybody is called the document notes. And so, you know, the regular Elliott notes is like the customer note. It's a regular Elliott note. I'm going to show everybody, you know, the example. This, the bottom right corner, that's a customer note, right? So you go to the customer record, and then you can basically click on the note button. If it's red, that basically meaning it's hot. It has a note associated with it. The note is associated with this customer number BSS046. That's the idea behind that, okay? Now, but usually in 8.5, right, when you are not in the customer notes, say suppose you are just in the menu level, haven't really, you know, go to the customer file, bring up the customer, the note button is actually disabled. But in 8.6, that button can be enabled. So that's the document note, okay? So the intention behind this document notes is for the employee or supervisor to document a procedure for each task. Now, from the management point of view, you have people working under you, and let's say for certain processing, only that person knows how to do. And what if that person quit? No, that's going to be bad, right? I mean, try to rebuild that knowledge up, okay? So usually for a more well-organized organization, you would try to ask everybody to document their procedure, right? So now we just say, okay, so we can use the document note as a way to document your operation procedure. So you go to customer file maintenance. Is there anything special you need to do? And for example, on the credit field, what do you usually do? And then on the collector, what do you do? Maybe there's a certain type of procedure in order to make the operation fit. And then that knowledge, okay, after a while, maybe even the manager, supervisor don't even know. So only that person knows. That needs to be documented from the company point of view. So that's the intention behind this, what we call the document note. And where is the note of this document note resided? It is reside in the root directory. So you look at this, what we call the Elliott. Typically, is data folder. associated with your document. But this document note is in the root directory. Because the document note is in the root directory, that means any document notes say it's shared for all company. That makes sense because you try to document a procedure for company 1. It probably should be the same procedure for company 2, right? Or company 3. Okay, so we share the procedure, okay, in document notes. So I just show everybody about this one, okay? And so first, okay, I want to explain the concept behind task name, okay? So if you, the task name is basically our program name. In this case, the task name is ARCUSMNT. That stands for account receivable, customer file maintenance, okay? That's the physical program ID. And if you bring up in our system, that's actually the code you are looking at. Now, so in terms of the document note, in terms of the regular Elliott notes, you bring up, you see that's a customer note for customer number BSS046. But if you bring up a document note, and you will see at the bottom left corner, it will say that's a document for ARCUSMNT. Okay, that stands for, this is a document note for customer file maintenance for that particular task. And so this is certain security that you can set up, say, okay, who can access this document note? First, you want to access the document note, you need to be, you can be a supervisor. If you're a supervisor for sure, you can access the document note. And then you can define up to 3 supervisors in the nodes global setup. And also, when we, in a global setup, we ask you a question saying, can all users create document notes, okay? And if you answer yes, then everybody can create document note. But that doesn't mean everybody can override other people's document note. It just basically meaning you have the ability to create new document note. But overriding other people's note, that's another security setting. On the other hand, you can say, no, okay, I want to limit it to certain people, and then maybe I don't want that, you know, non-supervisor user to create document note. Then you can say no. Then in that case, then we're gonna prompt you to say, please enter a list of users. Right now, this list of user is 20 user, okay, and then I think that should be big enough for most organizations, and except I don't know about Cheryl. What do you think? 20 users is big enough? No. So remember that just because you can create document note, it does not mean you can delete other users' document note or modify other users' document note, right? So, there's we also have a feature, okay? Remember earlier we talked about this 3 supervisor, right? And then in addition to that 3 supervisor, you can set up what we call a company organization structure. So in this case, I set up Edward. And I said, who is the people working for Edward? I said that everybody follow under me, right? And then let's say Roger is also supervisor, so then they can have additional people under Roger. So you can have a accompanying organization structure. So as long as I am a supervisor of someone, or of that someone's someone, right? As long as I am the top dog in this hierarchy structure, then that basically means I am either a direct or indirect supervisor of someone. Then I have a right to a particular node, so I can modify it or delete it, okay? That's the supervisory structure in the nodes. So this is an example. Let's say this nodes is created by Jim, okay? But I'm logging as Edward, and I can delete his node because I'm his supervisor. Now, so this is an example, okay, that let me think. Okay, so this is an example that that this particular user. Okay, I log into a different user. Okay, this user has the right. Okay, on the left side is if I log into a user that has the right to modify other people's notes, then I can delete it and I can save it by after modifying. If I do not have the right to override because whatever supervisory relationship, everything, it doesn't fit, right? So that means I'm not the supervisor of that person. Then I cannot delete or modify other people's notes. So that's basically the two examples. So so this is the difference between version 8.5 and version 8.6, okay? In version 8.5, on the right side, and then when you are at the menu level, you haven't bring up any customer record yet, the no button is disabled. But versus in 8.6, when you bring up the customer file maintenance, you haven't bring up any customer record yet, but at this moment, the no button is already enabled. If you click on that, that's document notes. So you are defining what you're supposed to do with this task, right? For documentation purpose. That has nothing to do with any specific customer. It's just related to this particular task called AR CUS maintenance, account receivable customer file maintenance. Okay. So so to summarize the document notes is an extension to the existing Elliott notes function. Because if you use it, it's kind of like this is just regular Elliott notes, okay? So it is an extension to the Elliott notes. And you can use it when no master record is identified. So in 8.5, when the no button is disabled, right? But in 8.6 is when those no buttons supposed to be disabled in 8.5. Now you can bring up the document notes. You can define a list of users who has the right to create document notes, and or you can let all users create document notes. And now, if you want to modify or delete other people's document notes, that's subject to the supervisory relationship. Okay, so I'm gonna do a demo, okay, and then hopefully this time, okay, I don't run into problem like not last time. All right, so I'm gonna go to account receivable. I'm going to go to maintenance, and maybe I go to custom type file maintenance. I'm going to remember, click on this guy, right? At this moment, this is document notes, okay? And it said document AR type maintenance. So I'm gonna say this is give a subject called whatever document of customer type, whatever. Okay. So I said Edward document this for customer type etc. Right? So you can just type a document, but then you say, well, Edward, there is no error correction. There's no spelling checker. There's no, all those things that you used to have with Microsoft Word, right? So, well, yes, so that's right. So what we can do is this, okay? Okay, this is, okay, see, there's already a checking, okay? So this is document no type in Word, and Word has spell checking ability, etc. Right? So then what I can do is you can have all this good documentation capability in the Microsoft Word, and then I can just copy it, and I can just come back here. I can Control V and paste it. Okay, so you can use other tool and just copy and paste. How many people know copy and paste feature in Elliott Notes? You do. Okay, so this is actually quite convenient. Okay, and and then you can even say go to, well, I already have another document. So here's the on our support photo, and I can just copy this. And okay, right here, just copy and paste it. Okay, so any question on document notes so far? Yeah. Not at the moment. Yeah. Right. I think how that issue should be revisited and review is 9.0. Okay, because currently the notes database design, right? It is kind of like design in the legacy day. You know how long we have this notes? We have it since 1997. Okay, and then you know, at the time the software is still called Macola, and then it was in the DOS day. Okay, DOS, DOS. Okay, and then I don't know. You guys know what is the DOS stand for? Okay, and some people say DOS mean deuce. Okay, and then so there must be a DOM, right? So there's a DOS operating system. There's a DOM operating system, and then so but but anyway, okay, so so it's a legacy design. So there's a lot of things to be desirable, okay, that what we can do. Like I said, for example, earlier I did a copy and paste, right? You know, each one of our notes record, it contains 10 lines or 60 character. So that's a 600 character. But the one I just copy and paste must be over 600 characters. So what do? We basically just concatenate multiple notes record, okay, and then indicate in special area, indicate this node record, next node record, they are all connect together, etc. And then so presented as one, single nodes. So the things you talk about, those what we call the hyperlink, right? Okay, all those things basically require the changing of the database, okay, and then to a more modern field instead of a 10 line of 60 character. We should just create one field called long bar chart. That's really the way to do it, okay? And then, but this is the legacy data, so that's the reason why there's a limited type of things we can do. And then so the solution is once we go to a truly relational database, and then this database we can redesign and then using the data type that make more sense, and then so as a result we can just basically save the information, okay, and then do all the features. The issue underlying you talk about has to do with the database. Yeah, that's basically what I'm saying. So we're working there or toward there, but there's things we have to do without changing the database. And there's a certain thing we can do, there's a certain thing not easily doable. That's basically what I can tell you. Okay. Any other question? Nope. All right, so the AR statement. So right now we actually using report desk to design AR statement. And in the past, actually, we have been supporting PDF post office for AR statement. And but right now we actually come out with a special version with a report desk. And it is more, how should I say, it's more appealing, okay, than the traditional PDF version of the statement. And but both of them are not user modifiable, meaning that if you want to change it, I have to change it. So this is a special point because didn't we say report desk can be modified, right? But we are going to categorize into two types of report desk. One is report desk that's user modifiable. And then there's another type of report that is not user modifiable. So this AR statement is the version that's not user modifiable. Okay, just so you know. But Nessun can modify it. Okay. And so the report desk version is more attractive and using a different font. And then so this is an example of how you run it. Okay. And then after you run it, okay, and then we can produce a statement like that, right? And so we said, oh, where did you get your nice image on the top left corner from? Okay, and that nice image is actually stay in the Elliott 7, or I should say the Elliott root directory. Under the Elliott root directory, we have a logo folder. You can put the compaddr.png file, okay? So it's a PNG file, not a BMP file, okay? BMP file, that's for the legacy laser phone designer. Those are BMP file. But for the report desk, okay, we use PNG file. So if you have a compaddr PNG file exists, then we will use it and then put it to the top left corner. And now you may say, but I may have a multiple company, right? Company one may name ABC company, company two may name BCD company, and then how can you use one single image file for both companies? Right. So then in that case, okay, you can have a subfolder called 01 folder, 02 folder, which will represent your company. And then inside that company, 01, you can place this compaddr PNG in that 01 or 02 folder. If it exists in those 01 or 02 folder, and then when we run that, we'll say, oh, this is in company one. And then I need to go to 01, check, does it exist? It doesn't exist. Then you use the logo root directory folder. If it does exist, then you will use it. So then you can have a company-specific image with this AR statement. Now, so that's basically for this AR statement. Now, just so you know that this is a little bit history, okay? So, Aaron, okay, many years ago, okay, you have a specific request, ask to do the AR statement, right? And at that time, we look at your requirement, and we know it's a big challenge for us, okay? And then so, but at that time, you know, this is my thought. We said we have a legacy reporting structure, which is I don't like, okay? And then I think we need to do better than that. And then so we basically saying that, okay, I'm gonna take this opportunity to make something happen. And then so we basically took your challenging, and then we go back, and then we said, I work with the team, I said, how do we go about doing this, etc., right? So internally, we just, you know, devise a very big project, thousands of hours, okay? And then I lose count how many hours we spend on this, okay? And And then so then we said we have to, because the whole idea is basically this, okay? The existing Elliott reporting engine is not able to do what you want to do. So we have to have a new structure to do it. So we go out, investigate, and then we found out, okay, so this is what we need to do, etc. We decide we need to do relational, okay, database. We need to do, we need to use a modern language, which is, this is written in the .NET, okay, and then C# language, and then we need to use this tool, that tool, etc. So we come up with all this, and then essentially we build report desk, and that's where it started. Okay, and then so in the year 2000, when it was ready, okay, so we're supposed to deliver to you, right? And but you didn't want to run 8.6. And then so so you know why it's run 8.6? We just said, okay, let's just defer it. And then we were actually going to release 8.6 in 2020, okay? And then but the COVID can't, and then we canceled the conference. Then we just say, okay, might as well just postpone it, and then that's add additional feature. So in addition to report desk, we add the power search, we add Avalara sales interface, we add this and that. Document nodes actually was also added later on, etc. So we just keep on adding new feature, and then we refine the existing feature, and then we're now releasing it. And so that's the whole story. Okay, so now the 8.6 has been released, and then I say that there are other people using this AR statement quite effectively now already. So just Aaron, so you know. All right. So the other things we did is this. Okay, our pick ticket, okay, has always been the fixed format, and but some of our users basically say, I need your pick ticket to be customizable. And so we have a solution called the set and design your own, okay, pick ticket. And or we short for design your own. And Satin, okay, is the developer there is called, her name is called Peggy Panici, okay. She's a very talented Go programmer. Avi, you know her? You know her, okay. So you know her, okay. She's a very talented developer, okay. And then but she used to be one of the most talented developer for Macola. And then so she came up with all this design your own pick ticket, design your own invoice, design your own check, design your own whatever, okay, and then make everything is designable by the user. That's the whole idea. And then so I just go talk to her. I said, can I buy your license out, etc. Right? And then so I bought our license, so I distribute it, okay? And except everybody in my company don't like to work on her code, okay? And so that makes the maintenance very difficult. So even though we still support Satin design your own, and but we are not putting much effort in it or improve it or etc. So eventually we came to the conclusion that we need to have our own version of design your own pick ticket. And then by following the Elliott convention, like the invoicing, order acknowledgement, etc., right? So finally, we come up with a pick ticket version of the Elliott user definable picking ticket. So right now, that's basically what we have. And so hey, but Alicia, are you guys using it in the outdoor already? Okay. What was the primary reason driving you to use this one? Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Right. And which is this support? How many lines you use per line agent? 2 lines. the previous version, I think, is 3-line minimum, right? So this is basically, I'm showing you a version of 1 line per line item. That's basically how concise you can do, because I basically thinking that because outdoor has a lot of line item per order, so you want to make sure that you can print as many line items as you can. So that's also, for the reason that we are using the expanded format. So then you can put more information in 1 line item. Okay. So, but anyway, so I'm glad you guys started using it. Right. That's Carol's works. Okay. So the okay, so that's basically this document you're referring to online. Okay. Okay, so the next one is in attribute. Okay. In 8.6, okay, we allow the date to be either using calendar select or freeform. I think actually in 8.5 and all the previous version, whenever you go to the calendar field, and then your only option is basically click on that calendar button if you want to change the day, right? And then that user interface, and then many people don't like it, and then because it slows me down, and especially you don't want to enter, because by default we default to system day. But what if you want to say pick a day, say 6 months, and then 15 days down the road, etc. Now you have to navigate through that user interface and then and find the day. It's much slower than if you know the day, you just enter it, right? And then so that's basically what we did in the 8.6. And then if you look at the difference between 8.5 and 8.6, I think it's not very clear, but what happens on the left, right? That's 8.5. That day field is actually grayed out, but you can click on the calendar and then you can select the date. But versus in 8.6, that day field is enabled. So you can just enter it yourself. And now, of course, in addition, you can use a calendar to select it. So that's one of the things, okay, we're changing 8.6 on the day field. Now, so we have a knowledge base article talk about that. And also we need to support various different conventions. So when you enter the date in the attribute field, what do we expect you to do to enter? Well, if you enter normally, you will enter the month slash DD slash YYYY. Oh, that's a lot of entry, right? Now, can you enter something easier? For example, we could just say, you just enter 6-digit, MNDDYY. You can say 060122. Oh, okay, so then you recognize the month, days, and year, and then you will convert it automatically. And then we have many different formats, okay, and then you can see that example, and then we all, allow you to enter in very different style, and then still convert it to whatever the ultimate is 8-digit day format. Now, this is a big one, okay? The invoice printing through deferred processing for a long time, and we do not allow invoice printing through deferred processing, okay? And then so the biggest issue, okay, with printing invoice through deferred processing has to do with PDF post office. And then because in the past, when we do PDF post office, we always require you to select a printer. And the reason we require you to select a printer is because when you print a PDF post office, you cannot guarantee everybody has email address, right? So what if you print an invoice for a customer that he doesn't have an email address? What do? We will print to the printer you select, okay, on your task. So then you get a hard copy. And so this customer doesn't have invoice, so you need to take that hard copy and then mail it to them or including in the package. Now, so now if you say, if I want to do the deferred, defer, we don't print to any printer. When you do defer, the only thing we do is we spool to disk, okay? Anybody want to make a guess why we make that strategy? The defer does not print to printer. We only spool to disk. I say? In case the printer is offline, okay, that's one. Any other? In case there are too many pages, so then if you don't do defer, then you can see it. Is that what it is? Well, that's true because if you do the defer and it has to print it, what if your printer is extraordinary big, right? And then you're going to just running with your laser printer and then wasting all this paper, etc. That's also a possibility. Okay, so yeah. For audit trail, I think that's also a good reason because if you send it to disk, you always have an audit trail. Okay, yeah. Invoice doesn't, right. You cannot post it until you print it. Correct. Actually, I think you hit the key point, okay, is this. On the workstation side, when you set up a defer, right? And you said, I want to print to printer ABC. How do you know printer ABC? That driver is installed on the server. You have no guarantee, right? So now, on the workstation ABC, you said, I want to print to printer ABC. Maybe the printer ABC is, say, a Canon, okay, copier, etc. So that driver exists on workstation, okay, but it does not exist on the server. So now you execute the defer processing. The defer processing is actually running on the server right now. And the defer processing does not have has a driver, okay, of a Canon copier. So it can't print. And then the worst part is if it can't print, and then it starts to executing, maybe even bump out, okay, etc. Now that's a big mess right there, okay? So when we do defer processing, we have to make sure that under all circumstances, the defer processing has to run, okay? It cannot stop it. So the only reliable way that you can do it is to make the defer processing spool to disk, because we can always assume you have enough disk space, right? Spool to disk. And then once we spool to disk, and then later on, you can just say, I want to print it later on. Then you can go to the spool report manager and then bring out and then print it out. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Now, even though not all the answer is exactly what I want, but I think I need to give the encouragement. So now, how do we resolve this issue? We do a defer, and you need to do the PDF post office. And then there's no email to send. we're supposed to print out hard copy, right? So now the strategy for us is this. Okay, we need to print a hard copy, but we cannot print to the printer. So we send to a directory called to be printed folder that's on the spool report manager. You're supposed to monitor that to be printed folder and then see all the test jobs. Those jobs you're supposed to print it out and then mail it. Does everybody look at? Yes. It's interesting you mentioned that. Okay, there is a way to suppress that. Okay, because we let me think. Okay, okay. Let me answer your question this way. Okay, is there's a way to suppress that if you print the duplicate invoice and then your purpose is to send those as the email, right? But for those that does not have the email, you don't want to bother. And we have a way to suppress it, not to spool to the to be printed folder. I don't remember exactly the configuration, but there's a way to configure that, just so you know. You probably search a knowledge base article, you'll find it. Right, right, correct. Yeah, you can system day. Right now, you are able to do system day. Or you can do system day just -1 day or something like that. You can do that too. Okay. So am I over my time? Oh, okay. So this one, okay, is in 8.6, okay, and we changed the date cutoff from the 2030 to 2050. For example, now the last day in Elliott 8.5 you can enter is December 31st, 30. That stands for 2030. If you enter 1131, that actually become 1931. So the cutoff is at 30. If a value is greater than 30, that's 19 something. If it's a value less equal than 30, that's considered 2000 something. Now we made that choices because in the first convention we adopted, this is actually at when it was at year 2000, right? Y2K. We adopt this convention because at that time we have a payroll module. In the payroll module, there's a birthday, and then we don't want to be too far in the future because it's very likely somebody may have a birthday in something like 1940 something, you know, etc. So we want to be reasonable safe. So we choose a 30 as a cutoff, and then so now 30 years back, okay, and then now we are we're approaching 2030, and then so so we need to choose a new cutoff date. So Elliott 8.6, okay, the new cutoff is 50. Anything less than 50 is considered 20 something. Greater than 50 is considered 19 something. Okay. Now okay. If you go to payroll module right now, okay, the latest version of the payroll module, the birthday field, we have expanded to 8-digit. So it will display the 4-digit year instead of 2-digit year. That's a special field. So you can enter 1920, whatever you like. So in general, in all the other places, we only enter 2-digit year. But payroll module, we enter 4-digit year right now. So does that answer your question? No, no, we don't convert data. 8.6 doesn't convert data. Remember that everything we do, right, is we want to make sure 8.5 and 8.6 compatible with one another, right? So one of the key things is compatible on the database level. Okay, that's one of the key things. Okay, and then so it's not because you use 8.6 now suddenly your data will just be converted. We don't convert data when using 8.6 from 8.5. But I want to give a word of caution, right? So remember I said in general you can run 8.5 and 8.6 side by side, right? And then but we discovered that if you have some workstation, you use 8.5. Some workstation use 8.6. And then so now you start to enter day in the between the 2031 to 2050 if you use day in that range, right? So you can do that in 8.6, right? But then when the 8.5 workstation bring it up, it said, oh, that's 19 something. And then this causing confusion. So if you do use day between 2031 to 2050 in this day range, then make sure you are all converted to 8.6. Don't run side by side, okay? But that's a more real case, okay? So, okay, I'm all done. Any other question? Okay, let's take a break until let's take a 10 minutes break, okay? And then we will resume the next session.